March 14, 1944, 14 minutes past midnight. The belly of a British Douglas Dakota aircraft cuts through the darkness above Nazi-occupied Yugoslavia, a cold, unforgiving black that swallows the stars. Inside the fuselage, the roar of engines drowns all thought. For figures sit in rigid silence, their bodies encased in borrowed uniforms they will not wear for long. Their parachutes sit heavy on their backs. Their hands are steady, but their hearts beat at the rhythm of drums only they can hear. Hannah Szenes, age 23, daughter of Budapest, poet and volunteer, looks out into the void. She was born in Hungary, escaped to Palestine, learned to farm at Kibbutz Yam, where the sea whispered promises of safety. But promises were lies told to those who believed the world was merciful. So she volunteered to jump back into the continent she fled. She volunteered to descend into the jaws of the machine that devoured her people. Beside her, Reuven Daphne, Yona Rosen, and Abba Berdichov, all young, all knowing, all choosing death's possibility over the certainty of inaction. The jump light flickers red. For seconds, Hannah rises, checking her rigging one final time. Her diary entry from months earlier echoes in the silence, words committed to paper when such commitment was still abstract. Whether this plan comes to pass depends on God and the British. I am ready to go. I am ready to give my life. These are not the words of a soldier desperate for glory. These are the words of a young woman who has already died 1,000 times in her imagination. Practicing the mathematics of sacrifice. The light turns green. They fall into darkness. What these for parachutists did not know. What fate had cruelly withheld from them. Their aircraft turned back towards safer skies. Was that for days later, on March 19, 1944, German tanks would roll into Budapest. The Hungarian capital would transform overnight from a place of relative safety into another outpost of the Nazi Empire. The entire mission, already dangerous beyond the comprehension of those who planned it, would become exponentially more lethal. But Hannah did not know this as she struck the wet earth of Yugoslav partisan territory, as she untangled herself from the shroud of her parachute, as she looked up at the stars that had guided her descent and understood that there was no turning back. The story of the Jewish parachutists of Palestine is a narrative that has been buried beneath the weight of larger historical events. It has been overshadowed by the grand operations and the famous victories, yet it remains one of the most extraordinary acts of resistance and courage the world has ever witnessed. A mission born not from the logic of military strategy, but from the desperate logic of love. In 1942, as reports of the Holocaust filtered into Palestine with horrifying clarity, the Jewish Agency made an audacious proposal to the British military establishment. They had no heavy armor, no air force, no factories churning out weapons. But they had something else. They had young men and women from Europe who spoke the languages, who understood the terrain, who carried in their bones the knowledge of home. Send them back, the Jewish Agency argued. Send them behind enemy lines. Let them organize resistance. Let them rescue the doomed. Let them be emissaries of the Jewish people in their darkest hour. The British, calculating in their pragmatism, saw value, but not in the Jewish Agency's vision. The Special Operations Executive, Britain's secret warfare apparatus, wanted wireless operators to communicate with partisan movements. Military Intelligence Branch MI9 wanted men and women to locate and rescue Allied airmen trapped behind enemy lines. The rescue of Jews, while not entirely dismissed, became a secondary objective, a moral appendix to a military calculation. What the British wanted and what the Jewish volunteers hoped to achieve were not quite the same thing. This tension between official orders and personal mission, between military necessity and moral imperative, would define the entire operation of 250 volunteers who stepped forward. 110 would be selected for training. The training began in March 1943 in Cairo. It was brutal in ways that transcended the physical. These were young people, many in their early 20s, ripped from the relative peace of Palestinian settlements and kibbutzim, thrust into an apparatus designed to break them. to test whether they possessed the psychological fortitude to jump into occupied territory, to survive interrogation, to resist under torture. They trained at Ramat David, near Haifa, where SOE instructors, who had seen the worst of modern warfare, began teaching them how to see it themselves: sabotage, radio, transmission, navigation, parachuting. The parachute training itself carried symbolic weight. Men were required to complete 5 jumps to qualify as parachutists. Women were required only 4. It was a bureaucratic distinction meant to shield them from combat roles, a legal fiction that fooled no one. Hannah Szenes completed 6 jumps, 5 by day and 1 by night, her training record noting that she had shown fearless aptitude. She wanted to be as prepared as any man. The organization had already decided she would be unequal to the task anyway. Women, they said, could not be deployed on offensive military operations. It was not until September 1940 for that Haviva Reek, born Emma in the Slovak mountain village of Radvik, would bypass this restriction by hitching a ride with American pilots flying to Slovakia. She would not wait for permission. She would simply go, but that was later. In March 1944, only Hannah and her team dropped into Yugoslavia. They landed in partisan-held territory, where Josip Broz Tito's communist forces were waging the most effective resistance campaign in all of occupied Europe. The partisans were an ideological mixture: Serbs, Croats, Montenegrins, Jews, Slovenes, united in the singular purpose of driving out the invaders. For British liaison officers, for SO operatives, for Allied commanders, Tito's forces represented the best hope of maintaining an Eastern Front against Nazi Germany. For Hannah and her comrades, the partisans represented something more complex. They represented potential allies in the work of rescuing Jews. But when the news arrived, when the radio crackled with reports of German occupation of Hungary, the calculation changed entirely. Hannah's home, the place where her mother still lived, was now under Nazi control. The mission that had seemed dangerous became a suicide mission. And yet Hannah Szenes did not ask for extraction. She did not request a transfer home. Instead, she spent 3 months with the partisans, moving through Yugoslav territory, coordinating with resistance movements, proving herself to fighters who had initially doubted whether a young woman from a kibbutz could survive in the mountains. In June 1944, after 3 months of preparation, Hannah made her decision. She would attempt to cross the border into Hungary. She would try to reach her mother. She would attempt to organize resistance and rescue operations in her native country. Her comrades warned her. The border was heavily guarded. The Hungarian police worked in coordination with the Nazi security apparatus. The odds of success were almost zero, but Hannah had already made her peace with probability. She had written her will. She had prepared her mind for the outcome that seemed most likely. She would go. She was captured at the border near Murska Sobota. A patrol of Hungarian soldiers found her with her radio transmitter. They did not know, at first, who they had caught. They only knew they had a woman in a British uniform carrying forbidden equipment. It took hours of interrogation before they understood what they had: a member of a secret Jewish commando unit, trained by the British, parachuted behind enemy lines, operating in coordination with resistance movements. The Nazis called this espionage. They called this treason. But what it actually was, what Hannah knew it was an act of love. The interrogations began. They were thorough in their cruelty. The Gestapo wanted to know the codes for her radio transmitter. They wanted names of other parachutists. They wanted to dismantle the entire operation. They offered Hannah deals: confess and live. They threatened her mother, claiming they would execute her if Hannah did not cooperate. They beat her. They stripped her naked in her cell. They knocked out a tooth and kicked her until her body became one continuous ache. But Hannah Szenes, this young poet from Budapest, refused to break. She did not give them the codes. She did not give them names. She did not give them the satisfaction they sought. Instead, at her trial in October 1944, she stood before Hungarian judges collaborating with the Nazi regime and spoke the truth. She told them they were the traitors, not her. She told them that their day of reckoning was coming. The history would judge them, that they would answer for what they had done to the Jewish people and to Hungary itself. It was a defiant statement that probably hastened her death. Trials in Nazi-occupied Europe were not forums for truth. They were theater where the outcome was predetermined. But Hannah spoke anyway, because bearing witness, even when no one listens, was an act of resistance. On November 7, 1944, Hannah Szenes was taken to a prison courtyard in Budapest. A Hungarian firing squad stood ready. She was offered a blindfold. She refused. She wanted the men who would execute her to see her eyes. She wanted them to know that she was not afraid. The bullet struck her body and she fell. Age 23, her life measured not in years, but in acts of defiance that could not be murdered, only martyred. Her mother, who survived the war by the intervention of Swedish diplomat Raoul Wallenberg, eventually received Hannah's final message. A note pressed into her hand by a fellow prisoner. "My dear mother, I can say only this: a million thanks. You alone will understand why there is no need for words here. With endless love, your daughter." These words, written in the darkness of a prison cell, transcend the immediate moment. They speak to every parent who has watched their child choose danger over safety, principle over survival, the demands of conscience over the instinct for self-preservation. But Hannah was not alone in this choice. While she descended into darkness in Hungary, others were making similar descents in different territories. In Slovakia, in late September 1944, Haviva Reek made her own leap from the sky. She had been born in Slovakia, had grown up in the Carpathian Mountains, had joined the Hashomer Hatzer youth movement in her village of Banska Bystrica. But like Hannah, like so many others, she had escaped to Palestine in 1939, seeking safety. She had joined Kibbutz Manat. She had enlisted in the Palmach, the elite strike force of the Jewish underground. And when volunteers were needed for a mission that would likely end in death, she had volunteered. Haviva dropped into Slovakia at precisely the moment when the Slovak national uprising was reaching its crescendo. This was not accidental timing, it was strategic planning. The Slovak people, tired of Nazi occupation and the puppet government that served it, had organized a resistance movement in August 1944. Partisans from various ideological backgrounds, communists, nationalists, Slovak army officers had united to overthrow the Axis regime. It was one of the most significant uprisings in occupied Europe, and Haviva Reek was assigned to work within it. She arrived with a complex mandate. The British wanted her to coordinate with partisan forces, to facilitate the rescue of Allied airmen, to act as a liaison between the uprising and Allied command. The Jewish Agency wanted her to rescue Jews, to organize resistance among the Jewish population, to preserve what could be preserved before the machinery of genocide consumed everything. These objectives were not incompatible, but they were complicated. Haviva and her comrades Raphael Reis, Zvi Ben Yaakov, Chaim Hermesh worked frantically. They established a soup kitchen in Banska Bystrica, a community center where refugees could find shelter. They organized escape routes for Jewish children to Hungary and ultimately to Palestine. They worked with partisan units to rescue Allied prisoners of war and downed American flyers. They became not soldiers in a traditional sense, but organizers of survival in the spaces between catastrophe and liberation. But the Slovak national uprising was crushed. By late October 1944, German forces under the command of SS Obergruppenführer Hermann Höfel had broken the back of the resistance. The Wehrmacht rolled through Slovak territory. The SS followed. And then came the Waffen-SS troops from the Ukrainian Galicia division, many of them hardened killers who had already participated in the worst atrocities of the Holocaust. Haviva Reek and her comrades, along with about 40 Jewish partisans they had gathered and trained, retreated into the mountains. They built a small fortification, gathered what weapons they could, and prepared to hold out until the Soviets arrived or liberation came in some other form. On October 27th, after just 6 days in their mountain camp, they were discovered. The Ukrainian Waffen-SS troops surrounded them. There was no escape. There was no final heroic stand, only the grim reality of capture by men who viewed Jews not as soldiers to be treated under the Geneva Convention, but as vermin to be exterminated. Haviva Reek and her fellow parachutists were taken into custody. On November 20, 1944, they were executed, not by firing squad in some military tradition, but massacred in a forest near Kremnica, part of the systematic violence that characterized the closing months of the war in Eastern Europe. Haviva Reek, age 30, was killed alongside Rafael Rice and Zvi Benyakov. The other parachutist in their group, Abba Berdichew, was deported to Mauthausen concentration camp, where he would later be murdered. Only Chaim Hermesh escaped, eventually joining Soviet partisans and surviving the war. In northern Italy, on May 15, 1944, another figure descended from the sky. Enzo Serini was almost 40 years old, ancient by the standards of the operation, which drew mostly on young volunteers in their 20s. He was an Italian Zionist, born in Rome, who had spent years working with the Jewish Agency to facilitate immigration to Palestine. When war came, he had volunteered for the British Army. When the parachute unit was being organized, he had not simply volunteered to send others into danger, he had insisted on going himself. Despite his age, despite his position as an organizer, despite the fact that the operation could have functioned without him, Enzo Serini had demanded a place in the mission. He would not ask others to do what he was unwilling to do himself. His landing in northern Italy was immediately compromised. Unlike Hannah, who dropped into partisan-held territory, unlike Haviva, who arrived in the midst of an uprising that still had momentum, Enzo landed in German-controlled territory. He was captured almost immediately. The Germans, understanding the value of their prisoner, transferred him to Dachau concentration camp. But even in captivity, even in the worst place the Nazi regime had constructed, Enzo Serini became a leader. He organized the prisoners. He protected the weak. He maintained hope even as everything around him conspired to crush it. On November 18, 1944, just 12 days before the end of the war in Europe, just as liberation was beginning to ripple across the continent, he was executed. Of the 37 parachutists who were deployed, 12 were captured. 7 were executed. Hannah Szenes, Haviva Reek, Enzo Serini, Rafael Rice, Zvi Benyakov, and to others whose names have become part of the historical record. These executions were not byproducts of war, they were deliberate acts of state violence directed against individuals who had chosen to resist. But what emerges from the historical documents is something extraordinary. None of these 7 surrendered to despair. None of them recanted. None of them asked for mercy in ways that might have granted them mercy. Instead, they faced the machinery of death with an integrity that the machines of death could not destroy. The question that haunts historical inquiry is whether the mission was a success or a failure. By the metrics of British military intelligence, by the narrow calculations of military necessity, the operation achieved certain objectives. Parachutists did coordinate with partisan movements. Downed Allied airmen were rescued. Radio communications were established. In Romania, parachutists moved swiftly and unseen through the Ploiești oil fields, rescuing stranded American and British flyers who would return to the air war against Germany. In Yugoslavia, the Jewish parachutists who worked with Tito's partisans became integrated into one of the most effective resistance forces in all of occupied Europe. From a purely military perspective, the mission was not without value, but from the perspective of the Jewish volunteers, from the standpoint of what they hoped to achieve, the operation was a tragedy. Of the Jewish population of Hungary, more than 400,000 were deported to Auschwitz in a matter of weeks in spring and summer of 1944. Hannah Szenes could not stop this. Haviva Reek could not stop this. No parachutist, no matter how dedicated, could have stopped the industrial genocide that was the Holocaust's defining characteristic. The volunteers had hoped to rescue thousands. They saved some. Some is not thousands. Some is not enough. And yet some is not nothing. What emerges from this historical moment? What becomes clear to anyone who studies the lives and deaths of these parachutists is that their mission was never primarily about military calculation. It was about maintaining the belief that resistance was possible. It was about refusing to accept the Nazi narrative that Jews were passive victims. It was about demonstrating to their people that there were those willing to fight. willing to die not because victory was assured, but because capitulation was unthinkable. In the decades after the war, the world would learn of these parachutists through historical documentation, through survivor testimony, through the written records that somehow survived the conflagration. The Jewish parachutists became symbols, national heroes in Israel, monuments to sacrifice, reminders that even in the darkest chapters of human history, there were those who chose to act. Mount Herzl in Jerusalem hosts memorials to several of them. Kibbutz Lahavat Haviva was named in honor of Haviva Reik. The ship Haviva Reik carried refugees to the newborn state of Israel. Hannah Szenes' poetry was set to music and became part of Israeli culture. Enzo Sereni's name is preserved in historical records that honor those who resisted. But beyond the monuments, beyond the cultural remembrances, what these parachutists represented was a transformation in how resistance itself was understood. They were not abstract symbols of ideological resistance. They were young people, poets, farmers, kibbutz workers, people who had wanted simple things from life: safety, community, the opportunity to build something in the land they had chosen. And they were asked to give all of it up. They were asked to return to the continent that had rejected them, that had hunted them, that was actively trying to murder them and everyone they had ever loved. What separated these volunteers from countless others who endured the Holocaust was that they were given a choice. They could have remained in Palestine, tending their kibbutzes, watching the war from a distance, surviving. Instead, they chose dissent. They chose to jump into darkness. They chose to fall back into the machine that devoured so many. To understand what they expected versus what they experienced is to understand the fundamental tragedy of their heroism. They expected that they could make a difference. They expected that knowledge of their presence, of organized Jewish resistance, would somehow change the trajectory of events in occupied Europe. They expected that by infiltrating behind enemy lines, by organizing partisan movements, by facilitating rescue operations, they could wrest control of circumstances from the Nazis and restore agency to the hunted. These were not unreasonable expectations. They were the expectations of people who believed in the power of human action, in the possibility of resistance, in the capacity to affect history through individual choice. What they experienced instead was the limitation of individual action in the face of industrial genocide. They discovered that the Nazi machinery was too vast, too efficient, too systematic to be disrupted by even the most dedicated resistance. They discovered that the nations of the world had chosen to permit the Holocaust, had decided that stopping it was not worth diverting military resources. They discovered that they could organize, fight, sacrifice, and the machinery would continue its work. Hannah Szenes could refuse to break under torture, but she could not stop the trains that carried her people to Auschwitz. Haviva Reik could rescue some Jewish children, but she could not rescue all of them. Enzo Sereni could maintain hope in the darkest places, but hope could not prevent his execution. And yet, paradoxically, this limitation has not diminished their heroism, it clarifies it. Their heroism consists not in the achievement of military objectives, not in the disruption of Nazi operations, not even in the rescue of significant numbers of people. Their heroism consists in the act of resistance itself, in the refusal to accept the Nazi definition of reality, in the decision to fight even when victory was impossible. The symbolism that bound together these disparate figures, that connected Hannah in Hungary with Haviva in Slovakia, with Enzo in Italy, was the symbol of radio transmission. Each parachutist carried a radio transmitter, a fragile piece of technology that represented the possibility of communication across the void. The radios connected them to each other, to the British command structure, to the partisan movements they worked with. But more than that, the radios represented defiance. The Nazis wanted to silence Jewish voices, to erase them from history, to make them disappear into the machinery of death. The radios said no. The radios broadcast a message across the darkness. We are here. We are organized. We are resisting. Hannah Szenes refused to give the code for her radio transmitter. Even under torture, even when threatened with her mother's death, even when the mechanisms of coercion deployed every psychological and physical weapon in the arsenal, She did not break. That radio, silenced though it became, represented her refusal to surrender human dignity to the demands of the state. In that refusal, something transcendent occurred. In that moment, the tortured became the victor. The helpless became powerful. The condemned became free. The epilogue to this story extends beyond the war, beyond the deaths of the parachutists, into the very nature of what their sacrifice means in the context of human history. In the decades after 1945, the world would struggle with the implications of what had occurred. How could an advanced nation, a culture of philosophy and music and literature, have organized the industrial murder of 6 million Jews? How could the rest of the world have permitted this? How could the machinery have continued uninterrupted even as the parachutists fell from the sky with offers of resistance? These questions do not have comfortable answers. They suggest that civilization is more fragile than we wish to believe. That evil can be organized as efficiently as the military machines that wage war. That resistance, however heroic, cannot always prevent catastrophe. But there is another truth that emerges from the story of the parachutists. A truth that is harder to articulate, but perhaps more important in the act of choosing to fall back into darkness. In the decision to resist even when resistance cannot possibly succeed, something essential about human freedom is reaffirmed. The parachutists flew toward a future they could not control. They did not know if they would survive the jump. They did not know if they would evade capture. They did not know if their missions would achieve anything. What they knew was that they could not remain silent. What they knew was that accepting the Nazi definition of Jewish powerlessness was a form of death worse than the physical death they might face. What they knew was that history was not predetermined, that even in the darkest circumstances, human beings possessed the capacity to choose, to act, to resist. This is the legacy of the Jewish parachutists. Not the military victories they achieved, important though those were. Not the lives they saved, significant though those rescues were. Their true legacy is the demonstration that even faced with impossible odds, even confronted with the machinery of death, human beings can choose to fall toward resistance rather than away from it. They can choose to descend into darkness not with despair, but with determination. They can choose to maintain their integrity even when every external force conspires to strip it away. In the end, what bound together Hannah Szenes and Haviva Reek and Enzo Serini and all the others was not merely the fact that they parachuted behind enemy lines. It was the fact that they parachuted toward their people, toward the places they loved, toward the communities they had abandoned for safety, choosing to return to danger because the alternative to remain safe while their people were murdered was unthinkable. They chose the jump. They chose the darkness. They chose to fall. And in that choice, they affirmed something that the Nazis could murder but could never destroy: the capacity for human freedom. In a world where the machinery of state had attempted to reduce human beings to abstractions, to statistics, to cogs in a great apparatus of extermination, the parachutists asserted that they were free. Free to choose. Free to resist. Free to maintain their dignity even in the moment before death. This is what freedom means when all external circumstances conspire to eliminate it. This is what resistance signifies when the possibility of victory has been erased from the calculus. This is what courage becomes in the face of the incomprehensible. Not the triumph of the strong over the weak, but the refusal of the weak to accept the verdict written for them by the strong. Not victory in any conventional sense, but the assertion of human dignity in the face of industrial attempts to destroy it. The parachutists fell from the sky in 1944. Most did not return, but what they transmitted across the void, what they broadcast through the darkness, was a message that transcends any moment and reaches into every moment where human beings must choose between comfort and conscience, between safety and solidarity with the hunted. They chose to fall, and in that fall, something was affirmed that cannot be murdered: the truth that human freedom exists not in the absence of constraint, but in the decision to act with integrity even when constraint is total.